All right, here we are, part 2, chapter 9. We start in right along with what is racism. A set of attitudes, beliefs, and practices used to justify the superior treatment of one group and the inferior treatment of another group. It begins to talk about overt racism and subtle racism. Then we're going to go into the theories of prejudice. One theory, straightforward, it's called the Scapegoat Theory. This is where a group is identified and focused on as being the cause of a societal's ills. And of course, the classic example were the Jews in World War II in Germany, scapegoated by the Nazi Party. However, this happens more often than we think. The problem with the economy, it's Mexican immigrants. Back in the 80s, the problem with America is welfare recipients. In fact, actually, the candidate for president at the time coined the term welfare queens. And again, he never said women of color with several children, but everybody knew what he meant, and that was a way to scapegoat the nation's problems onto a group that couldn't fight back. Another theory offered by a guy named Theodor Adorno talked about the authoritarian personality. And this is the belief that a group of people can be conditioned into accepting authoritarian conformity and submitting themselves to ideas that might not necessarily make sense based on a history of accepting greater authority rather than questioning it. And then the example that they used was, again, in Germany, before the Nazi Party ever took power, was the idea that things like plays and operas, particularly like Wagner's operas, and cultural messages made it okay to hate on Jewish people who were identified as being others and not acceptable. And that by the time the Nazis come along, then an idea like that seems perfectly reasonable. We talk about other kinds of prejudice, discrimination. He talks about genocide. Again, this is an extreme example where the entire killing of a people is brought up. But, we might feel superior to the Nazi Germany. But remember, we had our own genocide of Native Americans when European settlers took over the West. Ethnic cleansing is a sort of kinder, gentler term for genocide today. Now, here's where I give you one of those, did you do the reading? So I'm not going to go into Fagan's theory of discrimination. He has 4 major types of discrimination. Now, for some reason, reading through those makes it difficult, you can't figure it out, go ahead and email me and I'll try to explain it to you, or we can create an office hours on the phone. But that's one of those, did I do the reading? So I'm going to put it on the test. So now we go into the major perspectives on race and ethnicity. So symbolic interactionism is the first one that we're going to talk about. And they come up with something called the contact hypothesis. Now, this is an interesting one because the idea is it's easier to dislike and hate a group you actually have little contact with. So the idea being the more you have contact with them, the actual less you'll be prejudiced against them. Where we find the most discrimination in areas where we don't actually see a lot of diversity. So interesting facts, the second resurgence of the KKK in the 1920s actually had a great many millions of adherents, and where they had the highest percentage of membership in the KKK wasn't in the South, in Alabama or Mississippi. It was in places like Indiana and Ohio, in counties where they had like 90+% KKK membership and almost no black people at all. So the idea was, if I can sell you an idea about how a group is wrong and inferior, and there's nobody from that group to counter that, then I can sell that idea to others. Now the functionalists, they have a theoretical formation of something called the Assimilation Hypothesis, which was put forward by Milton Gordon, and this process can be tied to every European group that came to America. It's a stepwise progression where first you have what's called cultural assimilation, where you start to adopt to the dominant culture in America. Cultural assimilation is basically what's called Anglo-conformity. Make sure you underline that. This is where a group shows up and they're told to give up their normal ways of doing things in favor of the white or Anglo-Saxon way of doing things, and to give up their own cultural perspectives. So for the Irish, we had to give up talking like the Lucky Charms guy and drinking warm beer and being so overtly Catholic. Every so often you hear people talking about the melting pot. That's just really not true. We don't really have a melting pot. We've got Anglo-conformity. Group comes here, and if for some reason we like some element of their culture, we take it from them, repackage it for basically white European, Northern European English consumption, and then make it quote-unquote American. So, for instance, like St. Patrick's Day, which is a religious holiday in Ireland, is a way for everyone to drink beer with green food dye in it and to get way too hammered. That's not the whole point of the holiday in Ireland.